I just spent $3 million on my brother's wedding, only to find my ex-wife kneeling in the dirt, scrubbing the floors. 16 years ago, she ghosted me the second I went broke. Now, she's back, and the revenge I took has left the entire internet in tears. Half of you are going to call me a monster, but wait until you see what I did to her at the altar. You won't believe how this ends. Hello, welcome. You didn't find this by accident. These are stories of quiet courage, hidden truths, and people who chose heart over fear. If that pulls you in, please subscribe, tap the notification bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of imported lilies and the heavy, musky trail of $5,000 colognes. It was his brother's wedding, a display of opulence that Zayn had personally bankrolled, a sea of silk wrappers, diamond-encrusted traditional caps, and the rhythmic, bass-heavy pulse of Afrobeats that seemed to vibrate the very champagne flutes on the tables. Zayn stood in the center of it all, the undisputed lion of the family, adjusted his bespoke velvet agbada, and felt the familiar, hollow coldness of a man who had won the world but lost his soul. He was nodding politely to a minister of finance, his mind already drifting toward a tech acquisition in Nairobi, when a sudden crash of porcelain cut through the music. A server had dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres near the VIP dais. The elite guests recoiled with polished disgust, pulling their expensive fabrics away from the mess. Zayn turned, his reprimand already forming on his lips, but the words turned to ash in his throat as a woman in a sweat-stained catering uniform knelt to pick up the shards. Even through the hazy golden light of the chandeliers, even after 16 years of searching faces in every airport and boardroom across the globe, he knew the curve of that neck and the specific, tragic grace of those hands. It was Nia. The world didn't just stop, it inverted. The music became a dull roar in his ears, and the surrounding crowd blurred into a smudge of meaningless color. He watched, paralyzed, as she worked with a frantic, practiced humility, her head bowed, so low her face was a shadow. This was the woman who had once discussed existential philosophy with him until dawn in a cramped dorm room. The woman whose laughter had been the only fuel for his early, desperate ambitions. Now, she was a ghost in a uniform, a ghost he had chased through 1,000 sleepless nights, currently being hissed at by a socialite for getting a drop of sauce on a designer heel. Zayn felt a primal, tectonic shift in his chest. The icy walls of his billionaire persona didn't just crack, they disintegrated. He took a step forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, the weight of 16 years of silence crashing down on him in a single, suffocating wave. He didn't care about the minister, the wedding, or the spectacle of his own status. He only cared about the way she looked so small, so broken, and yet so hauntingly familiar in the middle of a room built by the very wealth he had once told her was more important than their love. The memory hit him with the force of a physical blow, transporting him back to a humid Tuesday night in a small apartment outside the university gates. They were 22, glowing with the reckless immortality of youth and the desperate hunger of the poor. Zayn had been pacing the tiny room, his eyes wild with a vision of skyscrapers and global equity, his voice harsh as he laid out his 5-year plan for dominance. He remembered the exact moment he had looked Nia in the eye and told her that love was a luxury he couldn't afford to maintain while he was building his empire. He had hinted, with the cruel arrogance of a young man who thinks he is the center of the universe, that a wife and a family were anchors that would only drown a man trying to swim for the shore of greatness. He recalled how Nia had sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes wide and glistening, absorbing the realization that she was being categorized as a distraction. He had been too blinded by his own reflection in the mirror of the future to see the way her heart was physically breaking right in front of him. He thought he was being honest and driven, but in reality, he was just being a coward who was afraid that she was the only thing powerful enough to make him want to stay. By the next morning, the apartment was half empty. There was no dramatic goodbye, no screaming match, and no trail to follow. She had simply evaporated into the thin, dusty air of the city, taking nothing but her clothes and the pieces of his heart he hadn't realized he'd given her. He spent the first year of his success trying to prove he didn't need her, using the silence as a whetstone to sharpen his ambition until he was the youngest billionaire on the continent. But as the years bled into a decade, the silence changed from a weapon into a haunting. He had hired private investigators, scanned social media databases, and even visited her village, only to be met with a wall of protective secrecy from her kinsmen. He had achieved everything: the private jets, the influence, the legacy, only to realize that he had built a kingdom for a king who had no one to share the throne with. Now, looking at her in the ballroom, he realized the ultimate irony. While he was ascending to the heavens of high society, she had been descending into the shadows of the very city he claimed to own. The 22-year-old boy who wanted to be untied had finally gotten his wish, and it had turned his life into a golden cage. Zayn watched her from the periphery, his body anchored to the spot as Nia moved through the crowd like a phantom. It was a masterclass in psychological invisibility. She navigated the throngs of dancing billionaires and preening celebrities with a bowed head and a silent step, clearing empty glasses and replenishing napkins with a speed that ensured no one would have to acknowledge her existence. He saw his brother, the groom, laugh and toast to family and the future, and the irony tasted like copper in Zayn's mouth. Here was the future he had sacrificed Nia for: a room full of people who didn't know the name of the woman serving them, a woman who possessed more soul in her pinky finger than the entire board of directors of his holding company. He watched a drunk guest stumble into her, nearly knocking her over, and Nia simply apologized. She apologized for being hit, and moved on. The sight of her humility was a jagged blade in Zayn's ego. He wanted to scream at the room to stop, to look at her, to recognize the brilliance he knew was buried under that cheap polyester vest. He began to notice the small details he had missed in his initial shock. The slight puffiness under her eyes that spoke of double shifts, the way she favored her left leg as if her shoes were a size too small, and the iron-gray strands of hair peeking through her head tie. 16 years had passed, and while they had turned him into a statue of success, they had clearly weathered her like a cliffside against a relentless sea. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, there was a quiet, stubborn dignity in the way she carried herself. She wasn't begging. She was working. She wasn't looking for a handout. She was fulfilling a contract. Zayn felt a wave of shame so profound it made his knees weak. He had spent 16 years thinking of her as the woman who abandoned his potential, never once considering that his own words had driven her into a world where she had to disappear just to survive the weight of his shadow. He realized then that he didn't just want to talk to her. He wanted to find out who she had become in the dark, and why she had chosen the struggle of the invisible over the comfort of his cold, ambitious arms. The heavy, gilded doors of the ballroom swung shut behind Zayn, muffling the exuberant roar of the wedding celebration into a dull, rhythmic thumping that sounded like the heartbeat of a dying era. He didn't signal for his driver or wait for his security detail. Instead, he slipped into the humid, midnight air of the city, his eyes locked on the service entrance where the catering crew was loading crates into a battered, white van. He watched from the shadows of a concrete pillar as Nia emerged, her shoulders slumped under the weight of a heavy plastic bin, her face illuminated briefly by the flickering orange glow of a street lamp. Gone was the university girl who used to wear sunflowers in her hair. In her place stood a woman whose every movement was dictated by the gravity of survival. As the van rattled to life, belching a cloud of diesel smoke that choked the fragrant night air, Zayn felt a desperate, irrational need to see where her world began when the masquerade of the elite ended. He climbed into his blacked-out SUV, trailing the van at a distance, navigating through the shifting landscapes of the metropolis, from the manicured lawns of the wealthy districts to the chaotic, neon-lit arteries of the mainland, where the city truly breathed, raw and unfiltered. The van eventually groaned to a halt in a neighborhood where the electricity was a flickering suggestion rather than a guarantee. Zayn parked a block away, his five-figure suit feeling like a suit of lead as he stepped onto the uneven pavement. He followed the sound of her tired footsteps through a narrow alleyway lined with corrugated metal and the scent of wood smoke and roasting maize. He watched as she stopped at a small, communal tap to wash the grease of the rich from her hands, her movements slow and rhythmic, as if she were performing a ritual of purification. The psychological weight of the distance between them was no longer measured in years, but in the layers of dust and grit that separated his air-conditioned towers from this cramped, vibrant reality. He stood in the shadows, a silent witness to her exhaustion, realizing that while he had been buying up the skyline, she had been treading the very earth he had forgotten existed. The curiosity gap that had driven him across the city was now a chasm of guilt. He didn't just want to know why she left. He wanted to know how he had been so blind to the cost of his own ascension. Nia's home was a single room in a tenement building that leaned against its neighbors for support, a structure that seemed to be held together by hope and the collective resilience of its inhabitants. Through a window left slightly ajar against the stifling heat, Zane saw her light a kerosene lamp, the soft, amber glow carving her features out of the darkness. He saw the way she meticulously hung her stained uniform on a wire hanger, treating the cheap fabric with the same care one might give a silk gown, a testament to a life where nothing was disposable. There were no photos of him on her walls, no relics of their shared past, only the functional items of a woman who had stripped her life down to the essentials. He watched her sit at a small wooden table, staring at a ledger with a focus that reminded him of their university days. But instead of philosophy, she was calculating the price of survival in a world that didn't care for her name. The silence of the alleyway was broken only by the distant sound of a generator and the soft scratching of her pen, a sound that echoed in Zane's chest like a heartbeat. The realization of what 16 years of absence had truly cost hit Zane with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. He had spent nearly 2 decades convincing himself that she had moved on to a life of comfort, perhaps with a man who wasn't as obsessed with power as he was. But the reality was a stark, unvarnished portrait of sacrifice. He saw the calluses on her fingers as she turned the pages of her book, and he realized that every diamond he had bought for a fleeting mistress and every million he had moved across borders was a mockery of the struggle she had endured in silence. The dream he had chased had become a nightmare of inequality, and he was the architect of the divide. He felt a sudden, violent urge to tear down the tenement and rebuild it in gold, but he knew that her dignity would never allow it. She wasn't a charity case. She was a woman who had been forged in a fire he had helped light. He stayed there until the lamp in her room flickered out, leaving him alone in the dark with the ghost of the man he used to be. The following morning, the sun rose over the city like a burnished copper plate, casting long, harsh shadows across the marketplace where Nia worked her second job at a small breakfast stall. Zane approached her not as a billionaire, but as a man stripped of his armor, wearing a simple linen shirt and trousers that still felt too expensive for the dust under his feet. He stood in the queue of laborers and students, watching her hands move with a blur of efficiency as she served steaming bowls of bean cake and pap. When it was finally his turn, he didn't speak. He simply let the space between them fill with the weight of the unspoken. Nia looked up, her hand frozen midair with a plastic spoon, and for a heartbeat, the entire market vanished. The noise of the honking buses, the shouting vendors, and the sizzling oil faded into a vacuum of pure, crystalline shock. Her eyes, once filled with the spark of 1,000 dreams, widened with a terror that was quickly masked by a wall of impenetrable ice. "One bowl," Zane said, his voice cracking slightly, the 2 words carrying the weight of 16 years of searching. Nia didn't scream, and she didn't run. She simply lowered her gaze and served him, her movements suddenly mechanical and cold. "That'll be 500, sir," she said, her voice a flat, dead thing that made his soul ache. She used the word sir like a shield, a formal barrier to remind him that he was a stranger in her world, a trespasser on the sovereign territory of her pain. Zane reached out to take the bowl, his fingers accidentally brushing hers, and he felt a spark of electricity so violent it made him flinch. She pulled back as if burned, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce anger that was more vibrant than any emotion he had seen in the ballroom. He realized then that he couldn't buy his way back in her life. He would have to earn his way through a fortress of resentment that he had spent nearly 2 decades building with his own arrogance. For 3 days, Zane returned to the stall at the same time, a silent sentinel in the chaos of the morning rush. He didn't push, didn't demand explanations, and didn't offer the stacks of cash that were burning a hole in his pockets. He simply sat on a low plastic stool, eating the humble food she prepared, letting the reality of her daily life seep into his skin. He watched the way she handled difficult customers with a grace that surpassed any CEO he had ever met, and the way she shared her own meager portions with the street children who lingered near the stall. Every gesture was a needle to his conscience, a reminder of the empathy he had traded for equity. Nia ignored him with a disciplined intensity, her jaw set in a hard line that signaled she would rather die than give him the satisfaction of a conversation. But on the 4th day, as the rain began to lash down in a sudden, tropical deluge, the market scattered, leaving them alone under the leaking canopy of her stall. "Why are you here, Zane?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain on the plastic roof. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the gray curtain of water flooding the gutters. "Is this a new game? To see how the other half lives before you go back to your ivory tower?" The bitterness in her tone was so thick it was almost tangible, a poison she had been brewing for 16 years. Zane looked at his hands, realizing how soft and useless they looked compared to hers. "I saw you at the wedding," he replied, his voice steady despite the roar in his ears. "I realized that for 16 years, I've been running toward a finish line that doesn't exist, and I look back and realize I left the only thing that mattered at the starting blocks." Nia let out a short, hollow laugh that held no mirth. "You didn't leave me, Zane. You told me I was a burden. You told me I was an anchor. I just did you the favor of cutting the rope." The words "cutting the rope" haunted Zane as he sat in the sterile silence of his glass-walled office later that night. He realized that his memory of their breakup was a sanitized version of the truth, a narrative he had constructed to protect his own ego. He summoned his head of security, a man capable of finding a needle in a global haystack, and gave him a single instruction. "I want to know everything that happened to Nia from the moment she left that apartment 16 years ago. Every job, every address, every hospital visit. And I want to know why she disappeared from the records for 3 years in the middle." He spent the night staring at the city lights, realizing that the skyscrapers he had built were just monuments to his own loneliness. He had always believed that success was a solo flight, but looking at the empty chair across from his desk, he saw the hollow victory of a man who had won the race but had no one to meet him at the finish line. The dossier arrived the next afternoon, a thick, leather-bound folder that contained the anatomy of a woman's struggle. As Zane flipped through the pages, his heart began to disintegrate. He saw the records of her working 3 jobs simultaneously while she finished her degree, the degree he told her she didn't need because he would be the provider. He saw the medical bills from the time she fell ill with exhaustion and had no one to call. But the most devastating revelation was the missing 3 years. Nia hadn't just been working. She had been caring for her younger sisters after their parents died in a car accident just months after she left him. She hadn't ghosted him because she wanted to. She had ghosted him because she knew he would see her family's tragedy as the ultimate anchor that would prevent him from achieving his dreams. She had protected his ambition at the cost of her own youth, disappearing so he wouldn't feel the obligation to help her carry the weight of her grief. Zane read the account of the funeral, a small, pauper service in a remote village, and he wept for the first time in 20 years. He remembered that month 16 years ago. He had been in New York, closing his first multi-million-dollar deal, celebrating with champagne and models while the woman he claimed to love was burying her parents in the rain, intentionally keeping her silence so as not to distract him. The psychological horror of his own selfishness was a suffocating shroud. He had told her he didn't want to be tied down, and she had taken that as a command to suffer alone. He realized that Nia's disappearance wasn't an act of desertion, but an act of supreme, sacrificial love. She had loved him enough to let him become the monster of industry he wanted to be, even if it meant she had to become a ghost to do it. Every penny of his billions
signified
now
peace.
felt like a drop of blood.
It signified partnership.
A currency
as they
minted
ate under
from
the
her
moonlight.
silent tears.
The silence
and her
wasn't
calloused
heavy
hands.
anymore.
He
It was
drove back
companionable.
to the market.
She asked
Not
him about
with the
farm,
intention of
really
saving
asked
her,
him
but
about
with
the
the
soil
intention
acidity,
of
the
surrendering.
rainfall patterns.
He
the
found her
past.
packing up her
and
stall
as he
in the
spoke,
fading light
haltingly
of
at
the
first, then
evening.
with
Her
passion,
movements slow
Adana
and
decided
weary.
to stop
He didn't
fighting
approach her
fate
with a
and
checkbook
start
or a
building
car
it.
key.
She decided
He approached
to
her
love
with the
him,
dossier in
not
his
out
hand.
of duty,
His
but
eyes
because
red
he was the only
and his
man
spirit
who had
broken.
ever truly
You didn't
seen
leave
her.
because you
With
didn't
the emotional
love me,
blockade,
he whispered
lifted
as he stood before her.
Adana's mind.
You left because
turned
you
to the problem
loved
of
me
their
too
livelihood.
much.
Obina
Nia
was
looked at the
hardworking,
folder,
but his
and for a
methods
moment,
were archaic.
the mask
He
of
farmed
eyes
based
shattered.
on tradition.
Her lips
not market
trembled,
demand.
and the
One
years of
afternoon,
repressed grief
while analyzing a
finally
spreadsheet
broke
she had
through the
created for his
surface.
expenses,
She leaned against
a
the
memory
wooden pillar
surfaced
of
from
her
the
stall
depths
and
of her
sobbed.
teenage years.
Not the
It was a
dainty
school
cry of a
excursion
movie
to the
heroine,
commercial
but
capital,
the raw,
Lagos.
guttural
They had
wail of a
visited
woman
the
who had carried
headquarters
the
of
weight
a
of the
major
world
bank,
on her shoulders
and a
for
young,
16
frantic
years,
data
and
analyst
had
had
finally
spoken
been
to the
seen.
students.
Zane
He
didn't
hadn't
try to
talked
pull
about
her
money.
into his arms.
He had talked about
He simply
patterns.
stood there,
People
a
think
witness
data
to the pain he
is
had
just
caused,
numbers,
letting the
he had
rain
said,
and her tears
waving a
wash
laser
away
pointer
the
at a heat
lies
map
of
of
the
the country.
past.
But
A week
data
later,
is hunger.
they sat in
Data
a quiet,
is desire.
secluded
If
garden
you know what a
of
region is
cafe,
consuming today,
far from the prying
you can
eyes
predict
of the
what they will
press
starve for
and the
tomorrow.
noise of the market.
The gap
Nia
between
looked
production
different,
and consumption
not because she was
is
wearing
where the
expensive
billionaires are made.
clothes,
The
she
memory
still wore
hit
her
Adana
own simple
with
cotton
the
dress,
force
but
of a
because the
revelation.
tension in her jaw
She sat
had
up straight,
finally softened.
her eyes
They talked for
widening.
hours.
She remembered
not
him
about the
explaining
wedding or the
how
money,
farmers in
but
the
about
north
the
would
years in
flood the
between.
market with tomatoes.
She told him about the
all at
nights
once,
she wanted to call
crashing
him,
the
but
price.
stopped herself
While
when
3
she
months
saw
later,
his face on the
tomato
cover of a
paste factories
magazine.
were importing
Looking
concentrate from
successful
China
and
because there was
untouchable.
no local
She
supply.
told him about the pride
It was a
she felt
mismatch
seeing
of
him
timing
build his
and data.
empire.
She looked
Even
out
as she
at
struggled
Obina's farm,
to pay for her
specifically
sister's
the
school
vast.
fees. I didn't want you to look at
acres in
me
the back.
and see a problem
Obina was
to be
growing
solved,
yam because
she said,
everyone in
her
Umuo
voice now
grew yam.
clear and
He
steady.
was selling to the
I
local
wanted
market
you to remember
because
me
that's where the road
as the
went.
girl who
But the
believed in
data,
you when you
if
had
she could
nothing,
find it, would
not
tell
the
her
woman
what
who
city
cost
you
you
in.
everything.
She spent the
Zane
next
listened,
3 nights on her
realizing that
laptop,
his wealth had been a
scraping
wall that kept
agricultural
the truth
reports,
out.
monitoring
built a
price
world
fluctuations
where
in
everything
city
had a
markets
price,
via online
but he had
forums,
never
and
understood
building
the
a primitive
value
predictive
of
model.
Nia's silence.
She realized
I
that
spent
while the
16
village was
years
drowning in
thinking I was the
carbohydrates,
hero of
the
my
uptown
own
cities
story,
were
he
experiencing
admitted,
a chronic
reaching
shortage
across the
of
table to touch her
processed,
hand,
packaged
this time
poultry
with a
feed
reverence
and
that made her
organic
stay.
vegetables.
But
The
I was
gap
just
was
a man
there.
who was too
She just
afraid
needed
of
to
the
bridge
weight
it.
of another
The
person's
presentation took
heart.
place
I thought being
on the
tied down
dining
meant
table,
losing my
which
freedom,
was now
but I
covered in
realized now
charts
that
drawn
being
on the back of
untied
old
just
calendars.
meant I was
Adana
drifting
had
in the
dressed
void.
up for it,
They sat in
wearing
the
one of her
golden hour
better
of the
dresses,
African sun,
signaling
the
that
light
this was
filtering
business,
through the palm
not
fronds.
domesticity.
And for the first
She
time
sat
in
Obina
nearly
down
2 decades,
and laid out.
the silence
We are
between
losing
them
money
wasn't a weapon.
every time we
It was
harvest.
a bridge.
She began.
He knew the road
her voice
back to her
confident.
heart would be long
We sell
and
when
difficult,
everyone else sells,
but he was finally
so
ready
the
to
price is
walk at her
low,
pace,
and we sell
rather
raw,
than demanding
so
she
the middlemen
run it
take
is.
all the profit.
Nia's voice was
She
a
pointed to
soft
the map of
melody
his
of
land.
pain as she
Obina,
described the
you are using
psychological
11%
toll
of your
being
capacity.
the ghost
That is
in the
not
machine.
farming. That is
She
gardening.
explained how,
She
for the first
proposed
few
a
years,
radical
she would
shift.
see his name
Diversify
everywhere
into
on
rapid cycle
billboards,
vegetables
in
like
news
habanero
tickers,
peppers and
on the
cucumber
lips
for
of
the city
strangers.
hotels.
Every time
and
he
use the back
succeeded,
acreage for maize,
she felt a
not to
bittersweet
sell,
sting.
but to process
His
into feed
rise
for
was a
poultry
confirmation
farm
that she had
wanted to
made the
start.
right choice to
Obina
leave,
looked at the papers,
but also
his
a
brow
reminder that
furrowed.
she was no
It was a
longer
language he
necessary
didn't
for his
speak.
happiness.
He saw soil.
She had lived in a
She saw
state of
supply
suspended
chains.
animation.
This will
Her
cost
own
money,
dreams
he said
of
slowly.
becoming an architect
Money we
shelved,
have in the bank
so
for emergencies.
she could provide the stability
Adana
her
reached
sisters
across
needed.
the table.
She had built
and took
small
his rough
houses
hand
for
in
others
hers.
in her mind.
The emergency
while
is
scrubbing
that we were
floors in
sleeping on
reality.
gold and
Zane
living like
realized
paupers.
that her
Trust me,
heartbreak wasn't
Obina,
just about
you know the
losing
land.
him.
I know
it was
the
about the
numbers.
systematic
Let me be
erasure
your
of her
eyes.
own potential
He looked at her,
to ensure
and for the
that
first
it
time,
remained intact.
he didn't see the
She had been a
chief's
silent
spoiled
partner
daughter.
in his success.
He saw a partner.
The one who
He saw the
paid
same
tax
fire in her
of his
eyes that he
ambition
felt
with
when
her
he
own
looked at a
life's blood.
sprouting seed.
Zane felt
He took a
cold,
deep breath,
sharp anger,
the kind of man
not
takes
at
before
Mia,
jumping off a
but at the
cliff.
version of himself
Okay, he
that
said,
had demanded
"We do
such
it your
a
way."
price.
The next
He
6
looked at
months
her
were a
and saw
blur
not
of
just the woman he
grueling,
loved,
backbreaking
but a
labor
representative
that
of
tested the
1,000
limits of
other
their
women in the city
newfound
who were doing
partnership.
the same thing.
They drained the savings
sacrificing
account to clear
their
the back
brilliance
acres
to fuel the
and buy
engines of
high-quality
men
seeds
who never looked
and
back.
irrigation pumps.
He began to see
The village
patterns
thought
of
they
his
had
own
gone mad.
life with a
Why are
new,
you planting peppers when
searing
it is
clarity.
yam season?
Every business
elder
deal he had
scoffed.
closed,
Obina has let
every
the witch turn
competitor
his
he had
head.
crushed,
They
it had
whispered,
all been driven by
but
a hollow
Adana
need to
was
prove
relentless.
he was untied.
She managed the logistics.
He had equated
creating a
independence
schedule that had
with
them working
isolation,
from 4 a.m.
and in doing
to
so,
midnight.
he had become
She didn't
a god
just
of a
sit
dead
at the
world.
computer.
I didn't
She
just
was in the mud
lose
with
you,
him.
Nia,
Her
he
fancy
said,
dresses
his voice
traded
thick
for
with
trousers
realization.
and boots.
I lost
Her
the
skin
ability to
darkening
be human.
under the sun.
I turned
They
myself
fought.
into a corporation.
They sweated.
And
they collapsed
I
in a
forgot
bed
that the
together
only
every
thing
night.
that actually
Too
grows
tired
in
for
value
romance,
over time,
but bound
is the
by
love
shared
you're willing to
exhaustion
work for.
that was intimate.
The
in
guilt
its own
was a
way.
physical
Then
presence
came the
in
harvest.
Zane's life.
It was
now.
bountiful.
A
The
shadow
vegetables
that
followed
glossy
him
into
and
boardrooms
perfect.
and
But the real
high-stakes
test was the
negotiations.
sale.
He found
Instead of
himself
taking the
looking
goods
at his
to the village
female
market,
employees,
Adana
his
hired a truck.
sisters-in-law,
She and
and
Obina
even the
drove
women on the street
3
with a
hours
new
to the
sense of
uptown city,
profound responsibility.
bypassing the local
He realized
middlemen
that the
entirely.
modern African success
She had already
story he
negotiated
represented was
contracts
often
with
built
3
on the
major
invisible
hotels
labor of
and a
women
supermarket
like
chain
Nia.
via email.
Women who stepped back
bluffing
so
about
men
their
could
size.
step up. He
When they
began to
backed
audit
the truck
his
into
own
the hotel
companies,
loading bay,
discovering the vast
procurement
pay
manager was
gaps
skeptical
and the lack of
until he
support
saw the
from
quality.
mothers and caregivers.
They offloaded crates
He had
of
created
peppers
a
and
culture
cucumbers
of
that were
untied
fresh,
productivity
uniform,
that
and
mirrored the
packaged
very
exactly as
ultimatum he
Adana
had
had
given
promised.
Nia.
The manager
The
signed
system
the
he'd
invoice
spent his life
and
building
handed
was
over a
designed
check.
to reward
It
the
was for an
cold
amount that
and the
exceeded what
unencumbered,
Obina
punishing the
usually
very
made in 2
empathy and
years.
community that
Sitting in the
Nia
truck
had
cab,
used to survive
holding
for
the check,
16 years
Obina
in
stared at
shadows.
it, his hands
He didn't just want to make it right.
He looked at
with Nia.
Adana,
He
who was
wanted
grinning,
to dismantle the
sweat
altar
streaking
of
her
ambition
face.
he had
He
built.
pulled her into a
He
hug
started
that
by
squeezed
liquidating
the
a
breath out of
significant
her,
portion of his
laughing
personal
a deep,
stock,
rusty
a move that
laugh
sent
that he hadn't
shockwaves
used in
through
a
the
decade.
financial markets.
The success
His
of that
advisors
first
were
cycle
frantic,
was the
calling
spark
his
that
phone
ignited an
incessantly.
explosion.
But Zane
With the
ignored
capital
them.
from a city's
He was no
sales,
longer
they didn't
interested in the
spend.
numbers on a screen.
They reinvested
He was obsessed with the
aggressively.
numbers of
They opened up
lives
the
he had
remaining
ignored.
89%.
He spent his
of the
evenings
land.
with Nia.
The farm
not in
transformed from a
fancy
quiet
restaurants,
homestead into
but in her
a
neighborhood,
bustling enterprise.
listening to the stories
Adana
of the other
hired
women who
laborers,
worked the market
then
stalls.
supervisors.
He heard about the
She set up a
brilliant
small
minds
processing
wasted
unit
on
to
menial
dry and
labor,
package spices,
the dreams deferred
adding
by a
value
lack
to
of
their raw
capital,
product.
and the sheer,
She managed the
unyielding
accounts,
strength
the
of the women who
contracts,
held the
and
fabric
strategy,
of the city together.
while Obina,
He was a
free
billionaire
from the
in a
worry of
room
money,
full of
became
giants,
a master cultivator.
realizing that the
He
real
could focus
giants were the
purely
ones
on the health of
cleaning
the
the
crops,
tables,
experimenting
and serving the
with organic
Trust was a
fertilizers
fragile thing,
and crop rotation.
a glass
They were
sculpture
a
that had been
perfect
shattered
machine.
and ground.
He was
to
the
dust.
heart of the farm.
Zane didn't
and
ask
she was
for
the brain.
forgiveness.
Amidst
He
the
simply
roar
showed
of
up.
tractors,
He helped
and
her
the ringing
close
of
the stall at
phones,
night.
Their
His
romance
expensive Agata
finally bloomed,
getting stained with
not
charcoal
soft and tentative,
oil,
but
much to the
fierce and
amusement of the
passionate.
other vendors.
Success
He brought her
is
books
a
on
powerful
architecture,
aphrodisiac,
the one she had
but
mentioned
mutual
loving
respect
16
is
years
even
ago.
stronger.
And he sat
One
in
evening,
silence while she
after
read
closing
them,
a deal
watching
to
the light
export dried
return her
chili to
eyes.
London.
It was
They
a
stood
slow,
on the balcony of the new
agonizingly
office they had built.
beautiful
Obina
process
looked at his
of
wife,
rediscovery.
who was commanding
They weren't
a team of
22
loaders
anymore.
below.
They
She
were
turned and
scarred
caught
and
his
seasoned.
eye,
And the
smiling
love
that
that was
sharp,
beginning to bloom
intelligent
between them
smile
was
that
no
used to
longer
intimidate
the
him,
wildfire
but now
of youth,
thrilled him.
but the
He walked
steady,
over, lifted her
enduring
off the
warmth
ground,
of a heart.
and kissed her.
Nia began
It
to
wasn't
let
the
him
kiss
in,
of a
one small
lonely
secret
farmer
at a time.
grateful for a wife.
The name of her favorite
It was the
sister,
kiss of a king,
the dream
claiming
she
his
still
queen.
had of
That
designing
night,
a community center,
the separate rooms
the way
were
she liked her
officially
tea
abandoned.
with too
They were
much
no
ginger.
longer two people
One evening,
sharing a house.
as they walked through
They
the
were
quiet
one
streets of her
flesh,
neighborhood,
one ambition,
Nia stopped
one
and looked
unstoppable
at him,
force.
her eyes searching
5 years
his.
later,
You're different,
the landscape
Zane.
of
You're not trying to
had
fix me
changed,
anymore.
and the
You're
epicenter
just
of that change
here.
was the
Zane
Silent Harvest
smiled,
Agro
a
Ally
genuine,
Ltd. estate.
unforced
The
expression
small
that hadn't
bungalow
touched
was
his
gone,
face in years.
replaced by a
Being here is
sprawling,
the only
modern
thing I've
mansion
ever
that
wanted
sat
to be.
atop the hill,
I just didn't know it.
overlooking
I
acres
spent my
of
life
green mechanized
trying to be
farmland.
somewhere else,
Adana
somewhere
and
higher,
Obina were no
somewhere
longer
better.
just farmers.
But here is
They were
where you are.
magnates.
And
Their
that's
produce,
the only destination
branded with a
that
logo
matters.
Adana had designed,
He realized
was
that
on shelves in
reconciliation
London,
wasn't about
Houston,
erasing
and
the
Dubai.
past.
They were
but about
exporting
building a new
processed
future
cassava
on top of the
flour
ruins.
and packaged
He wasn't
spices,
trying to buy back
earning
the
foreign
16
currency
years
that
they had
insulated them
lost.
from the local
He was trying
economy's
to ensure that the
fluctuations.
next 60
They had
were
brought
lived
power
with a
lines to the
transparency
village,
that
paved
made
the
the
road
silence
leading
of the
to their
past
farm
impossible.
and
The
employed
bubble
over
of their
200
private world
workers.
was
The
eventually
social
burst
dynamic
by the
had
reality
inverted
of
completely.
Zane's public
The
life.
elders who had
His
once
brother's
mocked
wife,
the barren
a
couple,
woman of high social
now sat in
standing
Obina's
and
waiting
low
room,
empathy,
seeking
organized a
advice
charity gala
loans.
and insisted
The women who had
Zayn
sneered at
attend
Adana
with someone
now
appropriate.
bowed low.
Zayn
when
decided
her
it was
SUV
time
drove
to
past,
bridge the two
calling her
halves of
Lolo
his existence.
and mother of the
He
soul.
invited Nia.
But Adana
She was
remained
hesitant.
grounded.
Her eyes
She walked
filled
the
with
fields
the memory
every
of the
morning
wedding
with
reception,
Obina,
where
their
she had been
hands
cleaning the
clasped.
floors.
They traveled
But
to
Zayn
Europe for
took her
business
hands in
expos,
his.
wearing
You're the most
bespoke
appropriate
African attire
person
that
in this
announced their
city,
heritage
Nia.
with pride.
Not because of what
They
you
were the
have,
talk of the state,
but because of who you
the
are.
illiterate
I
farmer
want them to see
and
the woman who
cast-off
built the
daughter
man
who had conquered the
they
world.
all admire.
Yet,
He didn't
inside
buy
their
her a
mansion,
designer
it was just
dress
them.
from a boutique.
They had conquered
He commissioned
poverty,
a local
they had
seamstress
conquered
from a
shame,
neighborhood
but they
to
had
create
built
a gown of
fortress
traditional
so
fabric
high that
that
they
was more
sometimes forgot the
breathtaking
world
than
below
any
could
European
still
brand.
reach up to grab
When they
it.
walked into the
The
gala,
call that shattered
the
their
room
peace
was
came on a
silent.
rainy Tuesday.
The elite of African
Echoing the day
society
Adana had
watched
first
as the
arrived
most
at the
powerful
farm.
man in the
Adana
room
was in her
walked
glass-walled
with
office,
a woman who
reviewing
carried
a shipping
herself with the
manifest
poise
for a
of queen,
container bound for Belgium,
despite her
when
hands being
personal
marked
line
by the
rang.
labor of the market.
It was an unknown number.
There were whispers,
She
of
picked it up,
course,
expecting a
cruel
supplier.
comments about her background
Instead,
and
a
her
frantic
sudden
voice on
ascension,
the other end,
but Zane didn't
a market
flinch.
associate
She
she
stood by her
vaguely
side,
knew,
not as a
screamed
protector,
over the roar
but
of
as
the
a
crowd.
partner.
Madam,
When a socialite
Madam
made a
Adana,
snide remark
you have to come
about
now.
the catering
It
girl,
is your people.
Zane
In
didn't
Alabama
lose
market,
his temper.
They caught
He
them.
simply smiled
Adana's
and said,
heart hammered
"This woman
against
didn't
her
just
ribs.
serve at a wedding.
Caught
She
who?
served as the
She
conscience I
demanded,
didn't have for
standing up.
16 years.
Your sister,
She
the
is
one
the
from the big
architect
house.
of my redemption.
She stole jewelry.
And if you can't
the boys
see
have caught
her
her.
brilliance,
They have the
it's
tires.
because you're blinded
They are
by
bringing
your
the
own
petrol.
reflection. It
Jungle
was a
justice,
moment of
madam.
profound
They will
social
burn her.
psychological
The
shift.
blood
For the
turned to
first
ice
time,
in Adana's
the invisible
veins.
woman was
Jungle
the most
justice,
visible person.
the
in
horrific
room.
street law
The
where
night
thieves
after
were
the gala,
necklaced with old
Zane
tires,
took Nia to the
doused
top
in
of its
fuel,
highest building
and set alight
looking
by
out over
angry
the
mobs.
sprawling,
It was a
glowing
death sentence
tapestry
that
of the
happened in
city.
minutes.
But he didn't pull out a
Despite
ring.
everything,
Instead,
the
he
cruelty,
pulled out a set of
the
architectural
witchcraft
blueprints.
accusations.
I don't want to just marry
into
you, Nia.
marriage.
I want to
the
build a
image
legacy
of her
with
stepsister
you.
burning
He showed her the
alive
plans
made
for the
Adana
Nia
gag.
Foundation.
She didn't think.
A venture capital
She reacted.
fund and
She ran out of the
incubator
office,
designed
shouting for
specifically
her
for
driver.
women in the informal
Obina,
sector.
seeing her
It
face,
wasn't
didn't
charity.
ask questions.
It was an investment
He
in
signaled
the
the
brilliance
security
he'd seen
detail.
in the market
The
stalls
convoy.
and the tenement
Now,
hallways.
he roared.
I want you to
Within
lead
seconds,
this.
they were
I want you to
tearing
be the
down a
architect
muddy
of a
road
new
in
system
two black
that ensures
SUVs,
no woman ever
sirens
has to
blaring,
cut the rope to
racing
save a
against
man's
the Reaper.
ambition. I want to
Adana
use
sat in the
everything I
back,
built to
clutching
empower
her
the
phone,
women who
praying
actually
not for
build
the
this
sister
company.
she hated,
Nia
but for
looked
the
at
humanity.
plans,
She
her fingers
refused to
tracing the
lose.
lines of the
She had built an
buildings she had
empire
only
on
ever
logic
dreamed
and
of.
data.
She saw
But
her
she
name
was
on the
rushing
masthead,
into a fire
not
that
as a
only
wife or a
mercy
companion,
could extinguish.
but as a founder
The scene at the
and
market
director.
was a tableau
The psychological
of hell on earth.
impact of his offer
By the
was
time
profound.
Adana's convoy
He wasn't
screeched
asking
to a
her
halt,
to join his life.
scattering the fringes
He was
of the mob.
asking to join
The air was
hers.
already thick.
He was
with the
offering her the
acrid,
agency
stinging
and
scent
dream
of petrol
he had
mixed
stolen
with the metallic
16
tang
years
of
ago.
blood. Her
Zane,
stepsister,
she whispered,
Chidinma,
her eyes
lay in the
filled
center
with
of the
tears of
circle,
joy.
her clothes
This is
torn,
more than a
her
proposal.
face a mask
Zane
of
nodded,
mud
his
and
heart full.
terror.
It's
With
an
old
apology
tire
in the
forced
form
down
of
over
a
her
future.
shoulders. The
I spent my
necklace
youth
of
telling
death.
you I didn't
A
want to be
young
tied
man
down.
with wild
Now,
eyes stood
I'm
over
asking
her,
you to tie
a
me
lighter
to a
in his
purpose
hand,
that is bigger
preaching
than
the
both
gospel
of
of
us.
street justice
Make me a
to
part of your
crowd
world,
that bayed for blood.
Nia.
Adana
Because mine
didn't
is
wait
empty
for her
without
security
you.
to clear the path.
The next year,
She
was a
stepped out of the
whirlwind of
SUV,
purpose.
her heels
Zane
sinking
and
into
Nia
the
worked
trash
side by
mud.
side,
Her presence
transforming
an
his
alien
cold
shock
corporate
of luxury
headquarters
in the
into a hub of
Stop,
female empowerment.
she commanded.
They didn't
her
just
voice
give out
cutting
loans.
through the din.
They
not
provided
with volume,
mentorship,
but with the
childcare,
terrifying
and
authority of
education.
wealth.
Nia's
The crowd
sisters,
paused,
now
confused
grown,
by this woman
with
who
the
looked
first
like a government
benefit,
official,
completing
but
their
ran
master's
toward the
degrees,
thief.
and
The young
joining
man
the
with the
foundation
lighter
as lead
hesitated,
analysts.
sneering.
Zane
Madam,
watched Nia
go back to your AC
transform
car.
from a woman
This
of the
which stole
shadows
from the
into a
poor.
visionary
Adana
leader.
didn't argue
Her natural
ethics with the mob.
intelligence and
She spoke
empathy,
the only language
making her
the
a
street
more
respected,
effective CEO
liquidity.
than he had
She
ever
signaled
been.
her security
He realized
detail,
that his
who
role
brought
wasn't
out
to lead,
a heavy
but to
duffel
provide the
bag.
resources
I am not
for her
here to
shine.
judge.
The foundation
she
of
shouted,
grace
her
became a
heart
model
hammering
for
against her
modern
ribs
African
as
development,
she looked at her
proving that
sister's
the most
weeping,
valuable
broken
asset
form.
a nation
I'm here to
had was
buy.
the untapped
She opened the
potential of
bag,
its women.
revealing
The
stacks of
psychological
cash,
atmosphere of the
more
city
money than the
began
market
to
had made in a
change.
month.
Other
This is for
wealthy
the stolen
men,
goods.
seeing
In
Zane's
this,
transformation,
she tossed a second
began to
bundle
question
to the
their own
ringleader.
legacies.
Is for your mercy.
The story of the
tension
millionaire
broke
and
like
the
a fever.
caterer became a
Greed
modern
replaced rage.
folktale.
The
A
tire
narrative
was
of
yanked
redemption
off
that
Chidinma's
challenged the
neck,
toxic
and the
masculinity
mob dissolved
of the
into a
old guard.
squabble over the cash.
Zane found that by
Adana's
giving away
guards
his
scooped
power,
up the
he
sobbing
had gained a
girl
peace
and
that his
threw her
billions
into the
could
backup
never buy.
vehicle.
He was
As
no
they sped
longer
away,
the lion of the
Adana
family.
looked
He was
back
a
at the
man
spot
who knew
where
the
his
name
sister had
of
almost
every
died.
woman who worked in his
She didn't
buildings.
feel love.
A man who
She felt
understood
a
that
cold,
the true measure of
shaking
success
relief
was
that
not
she
how high you
hadn't let her
climbed,
soul be
but how
stained by
many
the
people
smoke
you
of
brought up
vengeance.
with you.
The private
and
ward
Nia
of the city
were
hospital
finally
was
tied
quiet,
down,
a stark
not by the
contrast
chains
to
of
the
obligation,
chaos of the market.
but by the roots
Adana
of a
stood at the
shared
foot of
and
the
vibrant
bed,
life.
where Chidinma
The official
lay
launch of the
sedated,
foundation was
her
held in the
injuries
same
bandaged.
ballroom, where
In the
Zane
corner
had
of the room
first seen
sat
Nia
Necca,
cleaning the
the
tables.
wicked stepmother.
But this time,
the woman
the
who
room
had
was
once
filled with the women of
terrified
the
Adana,
market, the
who had
vendors,
strutted
the
through the
cleaners,
chief's
the
compound like a
seamstresses,
peacock,
sitting side
was
by
now
side
a
with the
shrunken,
ministers and the
gray
CEOs.
figure.
Nia
They had lost
stood on the
everything.
stage,
The
radiant in
inheritance
a dress
squandered
of
on
deep
bad
indigo,
investments and
her
scams.
voice clear
The mansion
and powerful
seized by
as she
creditors.
spoke to the crowd.
They had been living
For 16
in an
years,
uncompleted building.
I was invisible,
scavenging
she
to
said,
survive.
her eyes meeting
Necca
Zane's
couldn't
in the
meet
front
Adana's
row.
eyes.
Not because
She
I didn't
picked
have
at the
a voice,
hem of her
but
faded
because the
wrapper,
world
the
wasn't
shame
listening.
radiating off her
Today,
in waves.
we stopped waiting
She
for permission
expected
to be seen.
Adana to gloat,
We are the
to remind her
builders,
of the
the
witchcraft
survivors,
accusations,
and the future
to
of
relish
kind.
this karmic
The room
reversal.
erupted
But
in a
Adana had
standing
risen
ovation
too
that
high to
lasted
look
for
down.
10 minutes.
She placed an
A
envelope envelope
wall of
on the
sound
bedside
that felt
table.
like the breaking
The hospital
of a
bill is
1,000-year
paid
dam.
in full.
Zane stood in
Adana
the back,
said, her voice
watching her
devoid
with
of
a pride
warmth
that
but
made his
solid
chest
with
ache.
duty.
He
I have
thought
rented
back to
a
that
two-bedroom
crash of
apartment for
porcelain
you
at his
in the
brother's
mainland.
wedding.
It
The
is
moment
paid
that it
for 2
shattered
years.
his comfortable,
There's a small
empty
shop
life.
attached to it.
He realized
stocked
that
with
the
goods
mess
so you can earn a
Nia
living.
had been cleaning
Neko
up that
looked
day
up,
was
tears
actually the
streaming
beginning of his
down her
salvation.
hollow cheeks.
He walked up to her,
her
after
mouth
the
opening to
speech,
speak,
oblivious
perhaps
to the
to beg
cameras
for
and the
forgiveness.
dignitaries,
Adana
and kissed
raised
her
a
hand
hand
in front of the
stopping
world.
her.
You did it,
I'm not
Nia,
doing this
he whispered.
because we're
You're
family.
the architect.
Neka. I am
She
doing
smiled,
this because my
her
husband
eyes
taught me
reflecting
that
the
we do
lights of
not
the ballroom.
plant seeds of
No,
hate
Zane,
in our soil.
we did it.
She
You
turned
just
to
had to stop
leave,
being afraid
pausing
of
at the
the anchor.
door.
They
My
returned
driver
to
will
their
check on you
old
once a
university
month.
campus
Do
for
not
the
come to my
first time
house.
since they
Do
were
not
22.
contact me.
The buildings
This is your
were
second
older,
chance.
the paint
Don't waste
peeling
it.
in places.
She walked out,
but the air still
leaving her
held the
past
same
behind in
electric
that sterile
charge of
room.
youthful hope.
Finally,
They
free
walked
of the
to the
ghosts
small
that had
apartment
haunted her.
where it had all
Years
ended,
passed,
standing
and the
outside
empire
the door
grew.
where Zane had
But
given his
inside the
ultimatum.
mansion on the hill,
The ghosts of their younger
different kind of
selves seemed to
silence
linger
began
in
to
the
settle.
hallway.
It was
The
the
arrogant
silence
boy
of the
and
empty
heartbroken
nursery.
girl.
For all
Zane
their
reached out
success,
and touched
for all
the
the
wood of the
fertile
door,
land that birthed
a
tons
final
of
act of
yam
closure.
and cassava
I'm sorry it took me
annually,
so long to
Adana's
come back
womb
for you,
remained
he
closed.
said. Nia
It was a
leaned her
cruel
head
irony
on his
that the
shoulder.
mother of the soil
The time wasn't
could
lost,
not become
Zane.
a mother to
It
a
was
child.
just the price
The
of the
pain
wisdom
was a
we
dull,
have now.
constant
If we hadn't
ache that
lived
sharpened
those 16
every
years
month
apart,
when her cycle
we wouldn't
returned.
know how to treasure
They
the
visited
years
the
we have
best
left.
doctors in London
They spent the
and New
afternoons
York.
speaking to the
They
current
underwent
students,
painful procedures
not about
and
business or
drank bitter
success,
herbal concoctions
but about the
sent
importance
by
of
village
empathy
healers.
and the
But
danger
nothing
of
worked.
untied
The joy of their
ambition.
business victories
Zane
began
told the
to
young
taste
man
like
that
ash.
the greatest investment
Adana would
they could ever
sometimes
make
stand
was in the people
beautifully
they loved.
decorated room
And
they
Nia
had
told
prepared,
the young women
running her
that their
hand
brilliance
over the
was a
empty
flame
crib,
that no one
feeling
should
like
be
a
allowed
failure
to
in the
blow out.
one area
They were no
her
longer
money
the it
couldn't
couple of the
fix.
campus.
The pressure from the
They were
village
the elders,
was subtle,
the ones
but
who had
suffocating.
survived the fire,
The
and
elders,
come back
who
with
now
water.
worshipped Obina's
As they drove
success,
away,
began
Zane
to
looked in the
whisper again.
rearview mirror.
They
at the
visited him
university
in the
gates,
evenings,
realizing that the
speaking in
loop of their
proverbs.
past was
A
finally
man with a
closed,
barn full of yams
and the road ahead was
needs
wide
many
and
hands
open.
to harvest them.
Success,
They would say,
Zane
a
realized,
legacy
was
cannot
not
be
a
left
destination,
to a
but
bank
a state
account.
of being.
They urged
It was
him
the
to take a
ability to
second
look at the
wife,
woman next
a
to
younger
you
woman to
and
bear
know
him
that
an
you were
heir,
a better man,
as was his
because of her
right by
presence.
tradition.
It was the
Adana
sight
knew
of
these
1,000 women
conversations were
opening their
happening.
own businesses.
She offered Obina
sending
a
their
divorce
children to
one
school,
rainy night,
and
her
standing
voice
tall in a
breaking.
world that used
You
to
deserve a
overlook
father's
them.
joy.
He had spent his
she
life
whispered.
chasing a
Obina
modern
looked at her
African
with a
dream
ferocity
that was just
that
a
startled
hollow
her.
imitation of
He took her
Western
face
greed.
in his hands.
But with Nia,
I married a woman,
he had found an ancient,
not a womb,
powerful
he said,
truth,
his
that
voice
a man is
shaking with
only as
emotion.
tall as
You
the
are my
community
harvest,
he
Adana.
supports.
If it
He
is
spent
just
his
us
days
until
in
the
the
end of
foundation,
time,
working
then it
as
is enough.
Nia's CFO.
He sent the elders
his
away the
financial
next day,
genius finally
banning the
put
topic
to a
forever.
purpose that mattered.
His loyalty
He found himself
healed a part of
laughing
her
more,
heart that
sleeping
medicine
better,
couldn't touch.
and feeling a
The
connection to the
breakthrough
city that
came
he
not
had
in the
never felt
nursery,
before.
but from the state
He was no
house.
longer a man in a
Obina's
glass
agricultural
box.
model,
He was a
the
man
silent
on the ground.
harvest
He and
system
Nia
of data-driven
spent their
farming
weekends
had
in the
become a
village,
case study
building a
for the
new
nation.
community center.
The
in her
state was
parents'
facing
honor,
a food
ensuring that
crisis,
the next
and the
generation
governor
of
needed a
girls would have a
miracle
place
worker,
to dream
not a
and a ladder
politician.
to climb.
He offered
The ghost
Obina
of the altar
position
had
of
become the
honorable
mother of the
commissioner
future,
for agriculture,
and Zane was happy
Obina
to
was
be the
reluctant.
man who walked in her
He was a
shadow.
man of the soil.
He had finally
not
achieved
of
his
files
dream,
and bureaucracy.
but it looked nothing
But
like he
Adana
had
saw the
imagined
bigger
at 22.
picture.
It
We
was
have
better.
fed ourselves.
It was real.
She told him.
The story
Adjusting
ended
his
where it
tie
should
on the
have
morning of
begun
meeting.
16
Now
years
we must
ago.
feed the state.
At an altar,
You have the
but
heart
not
for
in
the
a
people,
cold,
Obina.
opulent bar.
I will handle the policy.
They were married in a garden.
They accepted
in
the
Nia's
role as a
neighborhood.
team.
Surrounded by the
Obina
women
became
from
the
the
most
market,
beloved
the staff from the
commissioner in the
foundation,
state's history.
and the family they
He
had
didn't
finally
sit in an
rebuilt.
air-conditioned office.
There were no
He was in the
VIP
fields,
sections,
rolling
no
up his
silk
sleeves,
wrappers that cost
showing
more than
young
year's
graduates
rent.
how to test
Just a
soil acidity.
celebration of love.
Adana,
that was as
officially
deep as
his
the soil
senior
and
special
as bright
advisor,
as the
ran
sun.
the ministry.
When it
from
came time for the
behind the scenes.
vows,
She
Zane didn't use a
dismantled
script.
the corrupt
He looked at
fertilizer
Nia,
distribution
the woman who had
cartels,
vanished to save him,
digitized the land
returned to
registry
change him,
and set up
and he
export
spoke from the
corridors
soul.
for small-scale
I promised to
farmers.
never be
Together,
untied again.
they revolutionized
I promised to
the
be the
state's
anchor
economy.
that holds you
The couple
steady
who had once been the
and
laughing
wind that
stock
helps
of
you fly.
Umuo for now
I promised to
its
spend
crowning
every
glory.
day
They
making
channeled
sure
their
that the
parental
world knows
energy
your name.
into the youth of the
Not
state,
as my wife,
funding
but as
scholarships
the woman who
and
taught me
startups.
how to live.
They had accepted
Nia
their
smiled,
fate, or so they
her
thought.
hand in his.
They were the
her
parents
eyes
of a
reflecting
revolution,
peace that had been
if not of
16
children.
years in the making.
It happened in the
And
seventh
I
year
promised
of their
to never be a
marriage,
ghost
just
again.
as Adana
I am here,
turned
I am
29.
seen.
She had been
I am
feeling
loved.
fatigued.
As the
which
music
she attributed
began,
to the stress
a blend
of
of
the
modern
ministry's
beats
budget defense.
and traditional drums.
She
The
fainted during
entire
a gala
neighborhood
night,
joined
causing
the
a
dance.
panic that made
Zane
the
looked
national
around
news.
at the sea of
When she
happy
woke up
women,
in the VIP
sisters who were
wing
now
of the
scholars.
hospital,
The
Obina
vendors
was
who were
holding
now
her hand,
entrepreneurs,
weeping.
and he realized
She
that he
feared
had
the
finally
worst,
won.
a tumor,
He hadn't
a
just
disease.
made one woman
The doctor
happy.
walked in.
He had helped build a
smile splitting
world
his face.
where happiness
Honorable
was a right,
Commissioner,
not a luxury.
he said to Obina.
The millionaire
It seems
who
your
once
agricultural
feared being
policy
tied down
is very
was now the
fertile.
happiest man
Adana
on earth,
stared at him.
anchored
You were
forever
16
to a
weeks
love
pregnant,
that had
madam.
survived the
And from a
silence.
scan, there
The
are
internet
two
is
heartbeats.
absolutely divided.
The pregnancy was
Did
high
I
risk,
humiliate her,
terrifying,
or did I
and
save
beautiful.
her?
Adana
Some say
spent
I'm
the
a hero.
last months on bed
Others say I'm
rest,
just playing God,
watching the farm
because
from her
I'm
window.
a billionaire.
Her hands
I've now
resting
dedicated
on the
my entire
impossible swell
fortune
of
to
her
making
belly.
sure no
When the
woman
twins came,
ever suffers
a
like
boy
she
and a
did.
girl.
But was
they
it enough?
arrived with a lusty
Drop a comment
cry
right
that
now
shattered
if you
the
think she
silence
deserved
of
what she
mansion
got.
forever.
Hit that
They
follow
named the boy
button,
Cheem Cam,
or you'll miss
and
the
the
most
girl Cam
controversial
Sia
update
Chukwu.
coming tomorrow.
The final scene of their story wasn't a grand party, but a quiet moment on the balcony. Obina, now gray at the temples, held the boy, while Adana rocked the girl. They looked out over the miles of green fields, the processing plants, the road they had paved, and the village that twinkled in the twilight. The stepmother was safe in her small life. The state was feeding its people, and their arms were full. Adana looked at the lonely farmer who had saved her, and she realized the greatest yield hadn't come from the ground. It had come from the patience to let love grow in the stoniest of soils. The silent harvest was finally complete. So she got the riches, the mansion, and the commissioner husband. But was she right to treat him like dirt for 730 days? Drop your rage in the comments. Is she a gold digger or a genius? Don't forget to like and share this insane story with someone who needs to see this.